It's going down, and you're invited for what they selling. We ain't buying, there is no running, there is no hiding, there's only fighting or dying. It's going down, and you're invited for what they selling. We ain't buying, there is no running, there is no hiding, there's only fighting or dying.
It's Going Down is a digital community center from anarchist, anti-fascist, autonomous, anti-capitalist, and anti-colonial movements. Our mission is to provide an autonomous and resilient platform to publicize and promote revolutionary theory and action.
Go to itsgoingdown.org for daily updates. Check out our online store for ways to donate, and rate and follow us on iTunes if you like this podcast.
Hi, so my name is Kit O'Connell, and right now I'm a freelance journalist. I'm located in Austin, Texas. I use they, them, or he, him pronouns. I've been living here for 20 plus years at this point and have seen a lot happening here. But lately I've been writing a lot for the Austin Chronicle, which is the local alt weekly about some issues in our community, including the struggle for trans rights. So that's kind of my background. I know we're going to talk about abortion access today. And while I'm not somebody who could have an abortion, I've benefited from the services of Planned Parenthood. And I've been involved in a lot of activism and reporting about, some reporting also about abortion access in Texas. So I'm relatively knowledgeable on that and would love to get into that too as we go. So yeah, I think that's kind of about me.
And that's a really good point to point out that Planned Parenthood does provide actually free healthcare to people.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, their services have been cut. I've talked publicly before about how I got a vasectomy at Planned Parenthood, and unfortunately, that's not something that's available at a lot of Planned Parenthoods anymore. It was actually a really affordable option at the time. I spent like about $500 on it, which is a lot less than you'll spend on that surgery. And just in general, they're very supportive of people of all genders, and regardless of your plumbing, they can help you out with STD testing and just other help. So they're really beneficial. I do feel a little bit like I'm sometimes talking out of my lane slightly here, and I'll see if maybe I can connect y'all with someone who's working on the front lines in the abortion access stuff for a future episode too.
Just kind of give us your elevator speech, off the top of your head. What is the situation in Texas right now, both in terms of the attacks on the LGBTQ community and abortion rights? Obviously, we're going to talk more in detail about both of these things, but just to kind of lay the groundwork for the wider discussion, what do we need to know walking into this?
Yeah, that's good, because we're going to get into the weeds on a few of the questions you sent me, so we should give the basics here. And it's good. I want to point out at the top, I think it's really valuable for you to link these two topics because they both relate to bodily autonomy. And I think it's important to remember that the Roe v. Wade decision, hinged on personal privacy and essentially bodily autonomy as the reason that, abortion access needed to be legal. And of course, this, relates personally to the lives of LGBTQIA plus people in Texas, very intimately, their bodily autonomy. So these are very closely linked. So what we're seeing right now is first off, as far as abortion access goes, the bill that was passed during, I believe, the last legislative session. So just a real quick to Texas law. Texas law is very weird, and Texas government is even stranger. And so the Texas government doesn't operate essentially all the time. They only meet every other year for about just under 6 months. So that means that the legislature didn't meet this year, and they're going to meet next year. There's these little short windows of time where the government tries to push through funding for everything that keeps the state running, but also whatever their agenda is, good or bad, for the next 2 years, essentially. So what that means is in the last legislative session, they tried to pass a lot of laws regarding to transgender rights. And I believe they did pass one relating to trans kids in sports here in Texas, but they were unable to pass some other laws that they tried. They did, however, pass this extremely draconian law. We throw that word around a lot, but this one is really intense. It's a ban on abortions after 6 weeks, and it's important to always emphasize that a lot of people take much longer than that to even realize that they are pregnant. And so is a ban up to 6 weeks, but not only that, it basically empowers everyone in the state to act as a vigilante and to sue abortion providers, abortion funds, and even family members that help somebody get an abortion. So in theory, if I help my friend who needs an abortion get to the clinic, whether that's tossing them $20 or a ride or, ordering their Uber or whatever it is, I could be sued under this law as somebody who helped provide an abortion. There's also just extreme, just waiting periods, medical interference. You have to have a transvaginal ultrasound, which is an invasive and unnecessary procedure. And that's necessary even if you have a medication abortion, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit more later, if you get that at the clinic. So it's just incredibly draconian. It's more invasive than any other similar medical procedure that somebody would get, and there's also bans on and limits on abortion through telemedicine, which of course was problematic for people in rural areas and during a pandemic. So it's just very extremely limiting here. Now, as far as the trans rights issues go, I've said that they weren't able to push through all their agenda in the last legislative session. For the last several sessions, they've just been trying to push through as many laws as they can relating to trans people. I'm sure a lot of the listeners remember the battle over all the bathroom bills, and people really came out and defeated those pretty resoundingly. But this has kind of been their follow-up, has been to go after athletes, to go after, healthcare, and also just like education and what sort of knowledge and openness about, gender and sexuality are available to students and young people. The most recent kind of battle began in December, I guess. Essentially what happened at that point is that the attorney general here, who's an incredibly corrupt individual, literally he's protected from multiple criminal charges by the fact of being the attorney general. And so he was in a somewhat contested primary against other Republicans. And so he needed a wedge issue in order to protect himself. And so he turned to trans rights. And the wedge issue he reached for was healthcare. Now, he issued a non-binding legal opinion saying that certain standard forms of healthcare for kids are going to be, or just certain standard gender-affirming forms of healthcare should be made illegal. Now, what he targeted was surgery and hormones. Now, I want to explain for people who aren't really aware that for trans young people, up until, 11, 12 and there, what happens is essentially social transition. The kids experiment with new names and pronouns. Now, as they start to reach adolescence, one option are these drugs called puberty blockers. And what those do is they delay adolescence, which gives time for the kids and their families to work with professionals, including therapists, experts in hormones, endocrinologists, all that, to figure out what to do next. At that point, when they're a little older, sometimes they'll start taking, hormones such as testosterone or estrogen and the other drugs associated with pharmaceutical gender transition. And of course, there are occasionally cases of surgery, but it's very, very, very rare when it comes to anyone under 18 and pretty much is limited only to mastectomies in older teenagers. So, but they're trying to kind of create this fear that people are essentially forcing young people to be trans and forcing them through irreversible drugs and surgeries. And that's just not true. All this is backed up even by the most mainstream of medical authorities. But this is a case where Texas is generating fear, using it as a wedge issue, and then stepping in to interfere with people's medical decisions. So again, this is a parallel with abortion, which is an extremely safe procedure that should just be, a personal decision of the person having one. And instead, we have government stepping in and deciding who can and can't access healthcare.
In the Austin Chronicle article you wrote, there is right now a temporary halt to politically motivated child abuse investigations of families with trans kids. So just talk about that.
What happened is they weren't able to push through this agenda. So Ken Paxton issues this opinion in December, which says these forms of healthcare are actually child abuse. He also said that mandated reporters, and what that means is a whole host of people who are trained to work with, anyone who basically works with patients, whether that's therapists, doctors, even people that staff certain abuse hotlines, can be mandated reporters. And that means if they think abuse is happening, they're legally required to report it to the state child protective services agencies. And normally that can at least be a good thing. There are obviously political issues, and racial justice issues with child protective services. But in general, if a teacher hears about child abuse, we want them to report child abuse. But what Ken Paxton said, actually, if you hear about parents giving their kids health care that supports their identity as a trans person or a non-binary person, that's abuse, and you should report them to CPS. Now, that was not legally binding, but obviously it creates an atmosphere of fear and doubt. It was followed up shortly after, early this year, by the governor issuing another directive, which said that CPS, the Child Protective Services, Department of Child Protective Services, should investigate any reports of families giving their kids trans-affirming care, gender-affirming care, which is, just respecting their identity, that any of those should be treated as abuse and investigated seriously. And we did see, fortunately, some multiple nonprofits come together to oppose that, including Lambda Legal and the ACLU. Some other organizations are also involved, and they sued in court. They got an injunction immediately, basically at the Austin level court, the Travis County court, saying these investigations have to halt. There's going to be a full hearing about this directive in July. And again, I want to emphasize this is not the normal legal procedure. This is just something that the governor imposed. There's supposed to be hearings at the very least if there's any changes to how the Child Protective Services Agency operates. But instead, the governor's just come in and said, no, treat trans healthcare as abuse. And so Lambda Legal and the ACLU have sued on behalf of a family that's being investigated. And that family, they're anonymous, but it's important to note that the family, the mother in that family, I believe, worked for the Department of Child Protective Services. And she has a transgender teenager. And she said, how is this directive going to affect me? And the governor, the state responded by basically putting her on leave and then putting her under investigation with CPS. The other person that's involved in this lawsuit is a psychiatrist from Houston, who's, suing on behalf because she's a mandated reporter and she doesn't want to have to report any clients to the state who are protecting or supporting, trans young people in their lives. And so what's happened right now is there's been a halt to this. The courts have said, hey, you can't keep investigating trans young people. And the state immediately appealed it. The next level of the court said, hey, no, you got to stop. And at this point, there have been 4 successive court rulings, all saying there shouldn't be investigations into kids or their families or the healthcare providers that help. But at this point, they're still appealing it. They're in front of the state Supreme Court. And again, there's going to be a hearing about this in July at the Travis County, at the regional level here. So the state is saying we can't even wait until July to investigate trans kids. We need to do it right now. And we're waiting to hear what happens in front of the Texas Supreme Court at this point. But right now, the investigations are supposed to be halted.
The law is saying that basically anybody dealing with kids has to report.
It's not even the law. Remember, it's not the law. This is an extra legal directive. The governor is not going through legal procedures. This wasn't passed as a normal policy of CPS. Mm-hmm. This is just the governor saying you have to do it. And the agency is doing his bidding because he apparently just can exert this kind of power. And so part of what the ACLU is suing about is that this is invasive of people's privacy. But the other thing they're suing about is that this is just not how it's supposed to work. This is them just completely circumventing normal legal procedures. Now, in theory, those mandated reporters are not currently required It's a non-binding directive, and theoretically they're not supposed to turn people in, but it's kind of unclear, will they have consequences in the future if they don't? And that's why there is this psychiatrist involved in the lawsuit.
The point I was trying to make is that across the board, various groups of medical professionals have stated, like, look, this is a bad, stupid idea, and you're actually hurting children by doing this.
Absolutely, yeah. And I want to emphasize that there wasn't just this one case. I want to say that there were at least a dozen or so cases that these nonprofits or reporters or various people have become aware of families being investigated by CPS, Child Protective Services. And it's also circumventing how Child Protective Services normally is supposed to work. I think this was going to be your next question, so I'm just going to jump into it here. Basically, like, what normally happens is somebody reports abuse to Child Protective Services. Child Protective Services can choose, does this sound like a credible report or not? Sometimes they just set them aside, so this doesn't sound like a credible report, and that's it. Sometimes they investigate the report, and there's various levels of that. I don't have to get into all the details of that, but the investigator has a lot of leeway, which is, good and bad in various cases, but they can come in and say, look, this is a healthy family. There's nothing happening here. They, at that point, go to their manager and say, hey, I found a healthy family. Their manager says, great, we're closing this case. There's nothing more to do here. But what's happening here is that the government is not allowing them to close out their cases. I spoke to a lawyer that's defending two families in the Austin area, Central Texas area, that are under investigation. And these cases are just being held open. And the agent has said, we want to close it. Their manager has said they want to close it, and it's now been bumped up through multiple, like the regional CPS has looked at it, the state level CPS, like 3, 4, 5 or more levels of bureaucracy have all looked at these cases saying, we don't know what to do with them, but we're not allowed to close them. And so they're just hanging, the way she described it is like the Roadrunner and the Coyote, they're just hanging over their head like that boulder that's going to fall. These cases are on hold because of the court case. But at any moment they could start again, and they're just being held open. So it's kind of just like this fear that's hanging over all these families' heads that know they're under investigation.
You mentioned in your article, in your reporting, that people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and online accounts like Libs of TikTok, who have been in the news recently, are really pushing this groomer panic online and in sort of the MAGA echo space. What role do these sort of influencers and grifters and politicians play in sort of setting the mood and just sort of pushing this thing forward?
This is kind of like this meme that they've gotten a hold of, this okay groomer meme, or, anyone that's, what it does is reframe the conversation essentially. And it's trying to put people on the defensive. So instead of people saying, look, I'm supporting trans kids, now they're having to answer questions of like, are you a pedophile? And those kind of questions obviously immediately turn into traps when people are being dishonestly edited by people that have learned from the likes of Alex Jones or Project Veritas. Nobody protecting trans people here is a pedophile. Again, these are things that the health care that's being given to them, mental health care, social transition, all this is incredibly supported by experts, all of who say it improves the mental health and reduces incidents of suicide in trans young people. But it's harder to have that conversation when people are yelling about grooming and accusing everyone of being pedophiles. And we know that this, when you say, think of the children, this is immediately a hot button issue, where you can say, that it's a hot button issue and it gets people emotional and reactive. And it especially gets people who don't understand what's happening, who feel like this has come out of nowhere, that suddenly there's all these, trans and non-binary young people. And so, instead of going like, maybe they have a new vocabulary, maybe there's a new, way of talking that's helping people understand themselves better, people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, people like Libs of TikTok are pushing this idea that instead people are being groomed into being transgender. And I'll talk personally, I'm in my 40s now. When I grew up, I felt I didn't fit into traditional boxes of male or female. I'm non-binary. And that's something I knew from when I was a young age. And, we see kids now who, there's a documentary that's coming out. I got to see it recently called Mama Bears. I think it's going to be on PBS. I recommend people check it out. It's mostly about parents of queer and trans young people. But the reason I'm bringing it up now is there's these trans young people in it who, they grew up in conservative families where, if they acted out of the most traditional gender roles, they were spanked or punished for doing so. And they still asserted themselves as transgender. This is something that people are born as, and, it's natural. It should be seen as natural and normal for people to explore what their gender presentation is and their identity is. And it comes from something really deep rooted in us. But rather than allowing the conversation about that, they want to push this groomer idea. Now, what do they get out of this? The important thing to say here is this doesn't stop with trans young people. Once they're able to define people who support trans young people as groomers, I think obviously the overall, and you'll see this in their rhetoric, they're very open about it. They want to define everyone on the left as pedophiles and groomers. And that's the precursor to some really serious fascist violence. When you have said that everyone on the left is a danger to children, well then, if you believe that, any violence at all, any action at all you take against those people would be justified. And it's very easy to see where that goes. It goes towards some really dark and violent places. We've already seen Tucker Carlson go on the air saying that fathers should go into classrooms and beat, physically assault teachers who talk about gender identity and sexual orientation. And the thing is, kids need to be protected and kept safe. And that means protecting them from abusers, but it also means letting them develop for themselves and figure out who they are. And there's this deep discomfort with the idea that young people have sexual orientation and gender identity. But it only comes out if they express a sexual orientation or gender identity that's not cisgender straight. As soon as they do that, these people want to define it as an illness. But it's partly this panic about the changing society, the fact that there's a new vocabulary that allows young people to express who they are in a way that they've never had. But it's also the building blocks to scary and really dire fascist violence in our not too distant future, because they want to define everyone to the left of them as potential pedophiles and therefore worthy of genocidal violence.
I mean, there's so much there to unpack. I mean, first of all, that builds on top of just now years and years of QAnon, branding the drag queen story hour as some sort of, I mean, really that was a precursor, I feel like, to a lot of this stuff.
Absolutely.
Because that was branded totally as, these pedophiles are going to come and read a story to your kids and groom them into having sex with them and all this stuff. Also, Pizzagate, this is stuff that goes back now to 2016. So this is almost over 6 years ago. They've been kind of pumping this same thing. I mean, they were saying all the Democrats are pedophiles. There's a cabal of satanic pedophiles that, drink children's blood and so on and so forth. I think also too, though, that what we have to realize is that they are literally rebranding transphobia and homophobia under this guise in order to have plausible deniability, so they can say it's not about hating these people, it's about standing against pedophilia, which of course, who would be against standing against pedophilia? Who's against, violence against children or abuse against children? Of course not. No one's against that.
Yeah. And of course it taps into, if we go back even further, the satanic panic, was mostly, most of the victims of the satanic panic, it's really important to recognize, were, some of them it was totally random, but a lot of them were LGBTQIA plus educators. And even aside from that, we aren't that far off. When I was growing up in the 80s, there were a lot of conversations about, is it safe to have a gay person in the locker room with you? Is it safe to have a gay person or lesbian as the teacher of your kids? And what we're seeing now is just they're repackaging that, and they've brought this old idea, for lack of a better word, out of the closet, and now they're trying to use it to force people back into the closet.
The sick thing is that it totally sidesteps any actual discussion or look at violence and abuse against children.
There's obviously a lot to unpack. There is this idea that alternative orientations, that people are queer or trans because of abuse, and that's just not backed up. Obviously, some people who are queer and trans were abused, and some people who are queer and trans were raised in healthy, supportive, homes. That's one piece of it. But I think, obviously the other thing too is it's like they're always looking for ways to distract from, like you said, the real problems. We know that abuse, when it happens of any kind, it comes from within the home or relatives or close people to the family. It's not about some mysterious guy in an alleyway teaching your kids to be gay. It's about, everyone in the family looking the other way at the uncle who's an abuser.
Right.
That's where abuse comes from. And we know that happens in right-wing families, in left-wing families. It happens in families. And the more we talk about this groomer crap attached to queer people, the less that we're talking about the real sources of abuse, of toxic masculinity and just toxic sexuality, in our culture. It distracts from all those conversations we could be having about, abusers that are elected to office, right now, and all kinds of things, the prevalence of abuse in families with police officers, that there's an incredible instances of domestic violence. There's all kinds of things that we could be talking about instead of this distraction, which is, really measurably hurting vulnerable people instead.
Well, you wrote on Twitter that all this legislation is creating a climate of fear, anxiety, and violence for LGBTQ people. You went on to write, some healthcare providers have reduced or eliminated services to trans kids and adolescents. Equality Texas and other organizations have been flooded with reports of threats against people across the LGBTQ spectrum of all ages in recent months, and there have also been verbal bullying, pressure from educators to stay in the closet, or even physical assaults against students.
I think a lot of what we're seeing right now is just kind of like a dismantling of the infrastructure that has kept LGBTQIA students safe or safer in their classrooms. We're seeing teachers are afraid to put up pride flags. They're worried about whether that will get them into trouble or even fired. There's a teacher in Irving, Texas, who may be fired. I haven't heard what's happened there, but they're essentially were the sponsor of the Gay Straight Alliance, which that's a thing that's existed for decades in schools across the country, and in both conservative and liberal communities. The Gay Straight Alliance is just a place, just like it sounds like, for students across all kinds of orientations to come together. And this teacher has been under attack. This English teacher, she's been removed from the classroom. And it's just been an attack out there. We've also seen libraries under attack in Llano, Texas. The library board was taken over recently by what was before just like a nonpartisan board of library experts that guided the library in that area, now being taken over by Republicans, and they've closed the library for days at a time so they can purge it of multiple books. So we're seeing that. The governor was threatening the Austin public schools over their Pride Week and saying that would be illegal sex education if they continued with it. So we're just seeing, I'll be honest, the violence and physical assault side of it, I don't actually have a lot of details on that. I've heard that is happening from my contacts at Lambda Legal and Equality Texas. I think the most important thing as far as that goes is that, I'm sure that this is leading to bullying of all kinds, but, with Tucker Carlson saying things like people should storm classrooms, it's not hard to see where this is going to lead. So, the violence is happening, but I feel like it's simmering and it's potentially going to turn into something much bloodier and much deadlier if this continues. And I think just in general, I've even been hearing from people on Twitter, people are afraid of, who live here, people are afraid who have to visit here. I will say, obviously a lot of communities, are still very supportive of queer and trans people in their area. Houston, Austin, Dallas, other communities too, even smaller ones, have thriving communities that still exist. But we are seeing, a lot of, especially what we're seeing right now is a lot of families with trans kids are feeling forced to leave the state because they're afraid either that they'll be under investigation or that they're going to lose access to the health care that their kid already depends on. They're already, in therapy for this. They're already on puberty blockers. There's a major hospital in Houston, which is, I believe in Houston, one of the major sources of it. That's something I think that's important for people to realize, is that there's only a few sources of this type of healthcare for young people. And, one of the major sources of them here in Texas, I don't want to get their name wrong, so I'm not going to say it, but they suspended offering this healthcare to people. And what that means is that these kids who are on puberty blockers or hormones may not have been able to get them temporarily. Now that, I believe, has resumed, but I'm not sure that every doctor that in the state that was offering this type of care has resumed. There are some of them are still too afraid to offer this health care. And the consequences of this are really dire. Like, the reason you take puberty blockers as a trans kid is because going through puberty is going to cause you extreme discomfort and dysphoria with your body. And you don't want to go through it. It gives them a pause where they can figure out their identity, figure out whether they want to go through traditional or the puberty that comes with their, what they were born with, or whether they want to take hormones. And it gives them time to work with experts, and to suddenly halt that, or if they are on hormones, to suddenly halt those, it can be extremely detrimental. And I also want to say, for people who don't know, these drugs have a long history of safe use, and they are still being used in cisgender people. There are cisgender young people, kids who are 8, 9, 10, who find themselves going through puberty early, and they're given these puberty blockers. They're extremely safe. Hormones are given to people for all kinds of reasons, in addition to transgender healthcare. They're extremely safe. These are all drugs that have an incredible history of safe use. So this is like purely a politicized attack on them, of course. And so it's just like we're losing safe spaces. It's hard, libraries are under attack. It's hard even to list. We don't just have time to even list all the different types of threats that people have faced over this.
You brought up one incident, and this kind of went viral on Twitter, but you said in one particularly harmful incident, a teacher claimed in front of the classroom that the reason the child was transgender was because they were being groomed by their queer parents. The mother told you in an interview, and they said once that directive hit, I was terrified that the teacher would report us.
Yeah, this, is a really tragic story, and I think it illustrates how there's not many, before I get into the story, I just want to say there's actually not that many healthcare conditions, really, where we can say there's just a clear cure. They exist there, but especially for, like depression, it's hard. You can't just say there's a cure for depression, but for gender dysphoria, for people that are struggling with their gender identity, the cure for it is to acknowledge that identity and give them the care that helps them, blossom into that identity that they feel is the one that they were born into. And it's really clear from the science that is what helps, these people. And that when the opposite happens, it can lead to depression, anxiety, and all too often it leads, to suicide and just mental health crisis. And so, this young person, they're 12 years old, non-binary, and have two queer parents, two women who are their parents, and they're in an Austin area public school, and they faced, unfortunately, a lot of bullying over that, the administration was unwilling to intervene on. And it has had just a over long term, really extremely harmful effect on their mental health. And it kind of culminated in the teacher of this young person announcing before their classroom that essentially that they had been groomed by their two mothers to be transgender, and that is why they are transgender. And then that, was the final capstone on this person's mental health crisis. And they needed hospitalization after that. And over the course of this lengthy need for hospitalization and treatment to help them out, this directive hits. And so, this leaves the family in this really sticky and terrifying situation because one, they know this teacher is bigoted, is incredibly bigoted, and could report them to CPS. And so they could be facing, this both an abuse investigation while their kid is in the hospital for a mental health crisis. And then the other fear on top of that is they don't know, going into something, they're approaching a hospital for care. They don't know if members of the staff might be bigoted and might report them. And so there's this fear where it's like, to get their kid proper health care, proper mental health care support in the hospitals or in the outpatient care that they go through as they continue to heal, they need their gender identity acknowledged. But in doing that and saying, hey, my kid's non-binary, they use they, them pronouns, their parents are always scared, is this going to turn against us? Is one of these healthcare providers going to be bigoted? Now, I will say that the vast majority of healthcare providers in Texas and the other states where this is happening, and their agencies, the nonprofits that psychiatrists and therapists work with, have all come out and said that they will fight this. Almost universally, mental health care providers are opposed to this and not willing to comply. But we also just, we don't know what that is going to mean. Does that mean that they're going to have to refuse care to people? It's just very scary and uncertain as far as what this will mean. And obviously, as we've seen with stuff like, say, vaccines, for example, and the coronavirus, the vast majority of healthcare providers are, in line with prevailing science, but there's still those weird, like doctors and nurses that are anti-vax. And so unfortunately, the same can be true here, that there's, a nurse somewhere that's, anti-trans. And so there's this fear for anyone navigating the healthcare system right now who is trying to support their trans kid that they don't know is the next person they work with going to be a bigot.
First of all, for a teacher to say that is horrific, but just that type of ideology, the reason that you're this way is because your parents did this horrible thing to you. I mean, there's so many implications there that are just, again, just this complete rolling back of everything that movements have fought for, that we've pushed back against decades and centuries of homophobia and patriarchy, to then reaffirm these backwards, conspiratorial, bigoted views.
It's horrifying to watch the ground. It feels like just slipping out from beneath us. And, it really leaves families like this one with without a lot of recourse. You mentioned my viral tweet about this. It's been wonderful to see so many people say, supportive things and how appalled they are at what the teacher did. But a lot of them are like, well, why doesn't the family sue? Well, the reason the family doesn't sue is because then the teacher turns around and reports them to CPS, or they get doxxed to some, person like Libs of TikTok, and suddenly this family is plastered across Fox News because they're suing a teacher in Texas. And so, families, rightfully are choosing to protect their kids, rather than speaking out, in a lot of cases. And in a lot of cases, they're just having to flee the state. And of course, that's a privileged position. Not everybody can afford to flee the state, especially if they've already been, spending a lot of money on expensive and hard to access trans affirming healthcare.
Well, one interesting aspect to this is that you write that there's been a mass resignation at Child Protective Services, or CPS.
As far as that goes, I believe from what I've heard, the Texas Tribune has done some great reporting on this. So I recommend people look that up. There's been at least a half dozen people that have resigned from that agency. The Tribune interviewed someone who resigned who was himself a transgender man. And, at first his approach was like, well, this directive is horrible, but at least I can protect this family, right? If they're going to be investigated, at least someone like me is going to do it who understands. But he quickly realized that the agency was being turned against him. And so he's resigned. ACLU and Lambda Legal in their lawsuit during one of the first hearings, and I imagine that she may be back in future ones. They heard from an investigator that resigned. Her name was Randa Mullinax, and she talked about how, as I mentioned, they're not allowed to close these investigations out. But another thing that's really disturbing is they're not allowed to take normal notes on them. They're not allowed to, like, for example, I don't know what they use, but say they use Slack or some kind of back channel to discuss these investigations. They're not allowed to do that. And that means that there's less of a paper trail later if people want to try to, prove their innocence and things like that. It's just very sinister about what that could mean. So, obviously it's wasting resources at the agency. It's clearly causing internal rebellion of some kind. They've also had multiple members of CPS filed a friend of the court, an amicus brief on behalf of ACLU and Lambda Legal's lawsuit. That's not something that you normally see. CPS, the Department of Child Protective Services, it's essentially a black box. You don't really hear about individual cases. They set policies that people can go to hearings normally if they're normally set and debate or give their input on. But it's really unusual for, individuals from the agency to speak out like this. So it's clearly caused a lot of upheaval as to the degree that it's distracted from their ability to investigate real cases of abuse. I don't think anyone right now has an exact answer on that. It's clearly wasting resources. I think, again, I want to emphasize that, essentially everywhere CPS has had credible accusations of being racially motivated in who they investigate and who they don't investigate. So I don't want to sound like CPS is like an angelic organization that is just pure at heart in their ability to target child abuse. But we also do know that there's cases where they protect kids that need protecting, and there's less of them able to do that. And of course, the question that I ask and other people have asked is, these people are resigning because understandably they can't follow the orders in good faith, but who gets hired to replace them? Are there just empty seats at CPS? Or are they replaced by people who do support this right-wing agenda and will, support the agency's directives? So it's kind of a rock and a hard place. They can't stay, but we all wonder who's going to come in to replace them.
Well, I want to turn now and talk about the situation in Texas with abortion access. There was recently a woman that was arrested for a self-induced abortion. Just talk about, what is going on there.
I mentioned earlier that, the law was SB 8. It's essentially fully gone into effect, and it empowers people to sue over whether or not they are anyone who assists with an abortion. They're allowed to be sued. That's not just abortion providers, but abortion funds, even family members. But what happened in this particular case is it's not entirely clear, like, under what law or what their justification for was this. Before I get into this case, talk about what we mean when we say self-induced abortion, right? So if you go to the doctor and get an abortion, a chemical or abortion with pills is really the best way to say it. They'll give you two different drugs for that abortion. One of them is called mifepristone. I always mispronounce that one, but essentially it stops the development of the embryo. Then there's another one called misoprostol, and misoprostol is what actually induces essentially a miscarriage, and so that undeveloped embryo is evacuated from the body. And it is possible to give yourself an abortion with just misoprostol. Mifepristone, the one that I have trouble pronouncing, is really hard to access. It needs to be refrigerated. But misoprostol is a generic drug that's also used for things like ulcers. And so that means that even your listeners could theoretically get a hold of some misoprostol and have it in case someone needs it. And if you search on Google abortion with pills, you will find procedures that tell you how to, in a more safe way, self-induce an abortion with misoprostol. Now, it's a very specific procedure. It's like timing, how many pills you use, how you take them, how long you hold them in your mouth. Very specific. And it can be done wrong. And obviously, sometimes in rare cases, there can be complications. Now, what's really important to know is if there are complications in this procedure and the person needs to seek medical care after self-inducing an abortion with pills, it's identical to a miscarriage. They do not need to tell their doctors, nurses, police, or anyone that they gave themselves an abortion with pills. They just need to say, I think I had a miscarriage. Now, I mentioned that not to victim blame at all what happened to this woman who was arrested, but just so your listeners know that if they're ever in this case where they've self-induced an abortion and they're having some kind of medical problem because of it, that they want to seek follow-up care, they just need to say, hey, I think I'm having a miscarriage. But unfortunately, what happened is this woman, Lizelle Herrera, who is down near the border, she's a 26-year-old, and apparently she said something to a nurse. She went to the doctor or rather the ER for follow-up to a miscarriage. And she said something to, I believe, a nurse about having self-induced an abortion. Or that's what the nurse claimed, at least. We don't really know even if that's true. And the nurse or whatever staff member it was turned this young woman into the police instead of supporting her. And at that point, she was arrested on murder charges for that self-induced abortion. Now, the law that we're talking about, SB 8, that allows someone to sue for assisting an abortion, that's a civil lawsuit. So it's not really clear under what grounds the police said that this woman had committed murder, even if she did self-induce her abortion. And now, fortunately, what happened, unfortunately, she was held in jail, I believe for at least some weeks. I'm not actually sure on how long, but far too long, obviously. But the district attorney looked at this and said, this is bogus. And, you know, there's no murder here. There's no crime here. We're dropping the charges against this woman and she is free. But that should never happen. And it's clearly a terrifying escalation and a sign of what, police would like to be doing, what the Republicans would like to be doing to anyone that is not able to access abortion through traditional channels for whatever reason, and instead chooses to have an abortion with pills that they do on their own. They want them to be prosecuted. And, they want them to go to jail for murder. And I think it's also, just terrifying. Miscarriages are something that happen with relative frequency to people who can get pregnant. And so the idea that someone could have a miscarriage, regardless of the circumstances, and be accused of murder, is just a sign of the terrifying attack and loss to the rights of people who can get pregnant in this country.
So is there any update to that case?
She is free and out and okay, as far as I know. The charges were never, she was held under murder charges, but the district attorney declined to bring them forward. And so at that point, she's...
Right. But there's nothing stopping the state from charging somebody else, though.
I mean, in theory, yeah, they could, continue to investigate it. Like if she did somewhere obtain pills, they could do something else. I'm unaware of anything else happening to her at this time, but obviously, we are seeing that the state is looking for all kinds of ways to go after, abortion and go after gender affirming healthcare. I don't know if you want to go into it, but they're also trying to go after some of the pharmaceutical companies that provide puberty blockers. And so they really are just looking for any way to close off these avenues. And so you're right, if I were her, I would feel very unsafe, regardless of the fact that I had these murder charges dropped.
Well, let's now turn towards maybe some more uplifting news. How people have been fighting back. There's been protests. Students have been doing walkouts. There's obviously been stuff happening on the legal front.
Sure. As I mentioned, Lambda Legal and the ACLU right now are successful in their lawsuit. So theoretically, these investigations are halted. Some of the healthcare that was suspended, some of the places offering gender affirming healthcare are offering it again. There have been some protests. There was a protest at the governor's mansion with some really beautiful speeches on behalf of trans families. There was a die-in at the Capitol, which was organized by a group called TROT, or Trans Resistance of Texas, and a national organization called Tear It Up. And I don't know a lot about Tear It Up, but they seem really interesting. They're kind of modeling themselves over the ACT UP groups that were fighting for gay rights and for access to AIDS drugs during the 80s. And so, we are seeing some more direct action. There have been some walkouts here, I believe. I'm not as aware of that as some of the ones that happened like in Florida, which got a lot of attention, because so much of this is happening kind of outside of the school side of things. It hasn't mobilized in exactly the same way here, but there's definitely been a lot of protests and a lot of young people speaking out at those events too. And one thing that's an interesting development is that Wendy Davis, who is, of course, the former Texas legislator, who did, back in one of the previous legislative sessions, it was 2013. She was part of this filibuster where she temporarily blocked the passage of another harmful anti-abortion law. And she was, of course, supported by thousands of protesters who literally chanted so loudly that the government could not conclude its business. And so her filibuster was stopped, but the people made so much noise that the Republicans literally couldn't hear themselves and couldn't pass this law. Incredible moment, one of the most amazing things I've witnessed. She's continued to be involved in Democratic politics and the fight for women's rights. And so right now she has just launched this lawsuit essentially saying that it's a free speech issue because if she's someone who donates to abortion funds. Abortion funds are, of course, organizations that help people pay for their abortions or pay for their transportation. Or, if there's a waiting period between your first visit and the abortion, they pay for like a hotel room so you can stay in town during that waiting period, things like that. So she's a regular donor to these abortion funds, and she's essentially saying that this law that means she could be sued as a donor to these funds is violating her free speech rights, which I think is, I'm not a lawyer, but that sounds like a compelling First Amendment argument. So that's very positive. We have seen a lot of support. The Austin School District said they continue with Pride Week, is pushing back. We've seen a lot of, district attorneys saying that they won't participate in any child abuse, prosecutions under this directive. So individual communities are fighting back in a lot of levels, and I think that is very positive. Of course, we're often seeing, that the state tries to circumvent local rights any way that they can, but there's a lot of people on the ground that support it. I think, like we've seen in Florida, I think what I've heard is that the majority of young people support their trans and queer, non-binary, gender non-conforming classmates. This is coming from, the dangerous, backwards, fascist adults. And so we need to protect them. But I think a hopeful thing to me is just that there are all these kids who are growing up in their truth, in their real full identity in a way that wasn't possible when I was growing up for a lot of people. And, that gives me hope and it inspires me to protect those kids, any way I can.
Has there been like a far-right mobilization against these protests at all? Is that something you've seen?
Absolutely. Some of the events there was the Trans Day of Remembrance or Trans Day of Visibility recently, and that was so large. I think some fascists kind of sniffed around the edges of that, but couldn't really do anything about it. So there have been some events that have gone off without any interference. But I mentioned earlier that there was a protest at the governor's mansion on behalf of trans kids and their families, and that was the far right tried to disrupt that very actively. They had a counter protest and press conference nearby talking about, their opposition to pedophilia and grooming, the same stuff that we've seen. But more alarming, we had, so of course, InfoWars, Alex Jones' fascist outlet, is headquartered here in the Austin area. And they drove he has this like armored reinforced SUV with huge speakers on it. And Owen Schroyer, one of his, handpicked sort of successors, and a little crew of fascists was driving around in it, saying just vile things over their megaphones about, groomers and trans young people, and then attempted to directly disrupt this event. And of course, theoretically there were state troopers there because it was near the Capitol, so that's their jurisdiction, and they were theoretically supposed to protect the event. But it took people putting their bodies, I was involved in this personally, just putting their bodies in between InfoWars and their supporters and this event for it to go off without a hitch. They came very close to taking over the stage area where people were speaking and completely hijacking the event. And even apart from that, they were yelling I will not repeat it on your radio show, the grossest things over their microphone about what they imagine we are doing as groomers to young people's genitals. It was very explicit, very disgusting. They were also trying to engage in all kinds of gotcha interviews or just like yelling stuff like, tell me what a trans person is, define it for me. And obviously there's no way to get into a healthy debate with those people. It was all just garbage. But it really took people physically protecting that event to get for it to happen successfully. So, and we've also, of course, seen Alex Jones, repeating just some incredibly disgusting things on his show for months now about trans people, encouraging all kinds of violence and disruption.
And what's ironic is that while he's having people like Marjorie Taylor Greene on his show talking about how they're going to protect the kids, he is literally ducking and diving the parents of Sandy Hook after years of pushing outright lies and conspiracy theories about their kids, which has resulted in like real, actual, pain and suffering on their part, and like InfoWars fans harassing them, calling them crisis actors and stuff like that. He's actually declaring bankruptcy now as a way to circumvent the lawsuits, but it just shows you what a grifter he is. I mean, this is a guy that doesn't care about children, talking about Alex Jones of InfoWars, doesn't care about kids, that has made a fortune. I mean, he's a very rich individual. He makes a lot of money selling supplements, has a very nice house. He lives a very comfortable life off of pushing reactionary, racist, fascist politics and outright lies and conspiracy theories that have actually hurt children. And here he is once again, out in the middle of it, trying to do more of the same, and it's disgusting.
Yeah, and I think it's, I'm obviously very happy to see these lawsuits essentially succeeding against him, but I think it's really important for people to realize that he has all these people ready to step in, like Owen Schroyer, or, but people who have kind of learned at his, metaphorical knee, reporters like Savannah Hernandez. There's tons of them, those are just two that showed up at this event, but that are wanting to step in and kind of play the same role as soon as his network collapses. So even if this bankruptcy succeeds in bringing down InfoWars, which who knows, we'll see, there's all these people who are ready to be the next Alex Jones and to keep profiting from this garbage. And it's really just harmful and shameful. And again, they don't care about kids. They're spreading, this messaging about kids that can and will lead to fascist violence.
You're listening to It's Going Down, part of the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network. Follow us online at itsgoingdown.org and on Twitter at IGD_news. If you like and appreciate this podcast, go to itsgoingdown.org/shop and give us a one-time donation. Sign up to donate monthly or donate through Bitcoin. Again, that's itsgoingdown.org/shop to support. And now, back to the show. People were wondering if there are networks of support being created in opposition to these laws, both in terms of getting people access to certain medical care or just in solidarity. Is that something you can talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I think some networks are happening and some already exist. There's some really great organizations that do support people in Texas. I really one organization that, especially since we mentioned Lizelle Herrera's case, the Frontera Fund is a really important organization that's been supporting people who need access to abortion, and that includes getting them out of the state if that's the only way they can access it. There's a lot of other organizations that you can give money to as far as that goes. The T Fund, which is the Texas Equal Access Fund, and Fund Texas Choice are two other great organizations that really deserve, our support. But I think also just, yes, there are going to be networks forming. During the 80s, we saw people who had networks that were helping each other access, drugs that helped treat their AIDS because they couldn't access them through normal methods. And we've seen that with hormones before, and we're going to see that again. We're going to see that and are seeing that, with abortion with pills. Obviously, that's something that, you can't really just talk about on a radio show. But those networks are forming. And I think, regardless of where you are, you can get involved. You can support groups like some of the ones I already mentioned. There's Trans Education Network of Texas, which is TENT. There's this Tear It Up group, like I said, that's forming nationally that you can, look for if you can participate in organizations like that or other ones. I think it's valuable just to educate yourself about abortion with pills and about self-induced abortion with misoprostol and about the safe way to do it. I know sometimes there's classes on it that happen, and if that is available, you should certainly take that opportunity. If you have the ability to keep that drug, if you're able to get access to it, and keep some around. If you have been given it for your ulcers and you can stockpile a little bit, then do so. And I think a really good thing is just to reach out to people near you that need support too. It's important to emphasize that while people in Texas need support, and I appreciate everybody that's donating here and vocalizing their support for us here, this is happening all over the place. And not just in the South, that this attack on schools, on libraries, on queer LGBTQIA plus rights, on rights of people to access abortion, it's happening all over the place. And so there's ways to participate where you are. I actually just heard about this case. There was a case in Minneapolis, actually, pretty recently. It was in Hastings, Minnesota. I'm sorry. If you Google the Kelsey and Chris Waits family, they're a family that I guess were relatively conservative, moved to a small town, but had a transgender kid and faced just incredible opposition and threats, and were incredibly unsafe. And this is again in a town of 22,000 that's a suburb of Minneapolis. So this is happening everywhere. And this attack on these rights is not just in Texas. So, look for mutual aid funds. I'm sure that more and more are going to be popping out, people that are, raising money to help people move out of town. I'm sure we're going to see more of that forming. Donate to GoFundMe's where you can, donate to these abortion funds, but also, educate yourself and tell people near you, if you have someone near you, for example, trans people in your life or a parent of a trans kid, let them know that, I've got your back. And if you need money or you need help getting out of the state, if you end up needing to pack up your stuff, or if you need somebody to testify about why you should have your rights or just whatever you need, I'm here for you. and let them know that you have their backs. I think that's really important right now.
Yeah, and we need resistance on the streets too.
Absolutely. I'm wondering what is going to happen. You know, we have here we are almost through April. We're almost to Pride Month. You know, what's this going to be like this year? Are we going to just have a parade with the corporations? You know, or are we going to actually, you know, protest for our rights? I would like to see some mobilizations. You know, it is challenging because when the bathroom bills were happening here in Texas, you know, there was a place to go protest, and this is happening outside of that. But even in states where it's happening within the legislative process, we haven't seen the same kind of mass mobilizations that we did before. Just that, you know, all the people, all the corporations that were speaking out against it. You know, so the response is unfortunately a lot quieter this time. And we do need mass protests. We need people in the streets. And I think we need, you know, militant queer liberation. We need pride not to be a parade, because we don't, you know, we have a lot to celebrate, but we have a lot to be angry about, and we need to be angry, and we need to, you know, express that anger directly at this point, because, you know, I think unless, we make things unworkable for the people who are instituting these kinds of policies, they're just going to keep doing it. They're going to attack libraries, schools, and just people directly any way that they can.
Tell us where people can follow your work.
Yeah, great. So I'm online. I'm very online, unfortunately, sometimes. You can find me on Twitter at Kit O'Connell, KitOconnell. You can find my work at kitoconnell.com, and a lot of my recent work has been published at the Austin Chronicle. So you can search for that. Look in the news section on Austin Chronicle. You'll find that my latest there, as well as links to all my other articles for them. And if you are in Austin or the Austin area right now, starting tomorrow, you can pick up my latest issue about trans rights, my latest article in the new issue starting tomorrow. So look for that in the coffee shop near you.
This has been the It's Going Down podcast. Check itsgoingdown.org for daily updates, columns, action reports, and news. Go to itsgoingdown.org/shop to support us, and follow us on all social media platforms. IGD, your daily resource for insurgent proletarian life.